The Autism Research Institute relies on the generosity of donors like you to make this webcast possible. If you enjoy this presentation, please consider making a donation. Thank you.
As we shared, the activity isn't a directed activity, so you're just welcome to doodle as we speak, because sometimes we know that people on the spectrum, including myself, need something to do while I'm listening, and it helps me to be able to focus more to that energy of listening. And sometimes when you go in schools, they tell you, put that away, you're not listening. Well, they actually shut off our ability to listen sometimes. But off topic, and so I'll go back to our presentation. And Paul and I created this presentation last year. And the reason why we presented this is because one time at the airport, before Paul was helping me to actually catch a flight because I didn't have the ability to travel alone. And so he had that ability, so he was supporting me in the airport. And we got to talking about our life and life processes, and talked about how often we got stuck and my children got stuck. And so we thought we'll just create a PowerPoint about getting stuck and moving forward. So this is our presentation. And Paul's going to start first with introducing himself and telling a little bit about himself.
Okay. I'm Paul Nussbaum, and as Sondra was talking about, mentioned how we got started on this topic, and both of us realized the usefulness for this topic and for this material. So we got to work. So anyways, I'm just going to do a brief introduction of myself, and then Sondra will follow, and then we'll get into the presentation. So for me, I guess I have a long history. I'm working on a biography of myself. Right now I have several hundred pages compiled when I go back through the last 50 years of my life. And here, basically in a nutshell, I was diagnosed with ASD, with autism, with Asperger's at age of 40, after a long struggle with employment issues and other life and social issues. And before that time, I had no clue that I had that disability, that I was ASD. And before that, I was diagnosed with ADD and other things, and it was like the mystery disability because nobody could really figure it out, and had a lot of life struggles, and was sickly as a child and born premature and all of those things. And I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, and that's where the Greater Bay Area. That's where I grew up, and that's where I've spent most of my life. Lived in a couple of other places, and currently working as a handyman, a business that I started with. As a birthed from my struggle with the employment issues, I came up with the idea of starting a handyman business, and then that did pretty well. Have been doing it for the last about 14 years, and it's gone through its ups and downs with the economy. And I feel pretty good about being able to do that. And in addition to that, I work as an autism consultant, doing trainings and presentations with two consultants that are educators from the Lodi School District, which is near Sacramento, training teachers and administrators and Department of Rehab and other staff that provide services for people on the spectrum and other disabilities. One of the things I love to do is I'm into outdoor sports. I'm into avid backpacker, cross-country skier, and among other things. And I like anything that's outdoors. I like the nature, and it really balances me. And I think I've always been that way. I have a BA degree in geography, which I worked really hard to get after much struggle going through school. Didn't have the supports. Somehow I just clawed my way through and was able to finish it by the grace of God. And currently I'm doing autism advocacy work, namely working with AGI. I'm a partner with AGI and also one of the founding members of Ascend, which is an advocacy group up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and among other things. And that was started in '99. As far as my family life goes, my parents were generally pretty supporting, even though they didn't know what to do, and there was a lot of issues there, and just trying to progress and just trying to fit in and all of that stuff. And with friendships, same kind of thing, trying to fit into the social network had its challenges for me, and that's a whole nother story there, and went through a lot of difficult times in growing up. And finally, I learned some of the social nuances and social protocol later in life, but it was a process. And my current struggles are sometimes, I guess, trying to catch up, feeling like I have to catch up. I mean, still sometimes I feel like I have to catch up career-wise, but it's not as important as it used to be in earlier years. And I think I go through a lot of the similar life issues that other people have, and just going through life processes, and then just trying to make my way in the world. And sometimes that can be a little bit difficult. Fortunately, I don't have quite as many of the sensory issues that other ASD people, but I have enough of them where it still makes for challenges, and particularly in stressful employment and social situations. And so I have to advocate for those for myself. And then overcoming the struggles is, I think, a lot of what Valerie shared in the last presentation. Some of the self-advocacy pieces, I apply a lot of those techniques to my own life, and I find them to be very effective. And also I'm just continuing to work on those. And before I close my introduction, one of the major projects that I finished in the self-advocacy was doing, and I went with my outdoor wilderness survival stuff. My survival interests was to be able to put a team together and cross the Sierra Nevada to ski across the Sierra Nevada for a fundraising advocacy project for our Ascend group with the support of a number of people. And then also I'm working on a larger project now to cross the Greenland ice cap as a advocacy awareness project for autism-related issues. And that's me in a nutshell.
Many of you know me. I'm Sondra Williams, and I'm an adult living with autism. I'm a parent of 4 children with Asperger's syndrome. I'm also, well, to share about my children, my oldest is Amy, and she's going to be 25 and in October the 31st. And then I have a son named Isaiah, and he's 22. Actually, he's 23 now. And I have a son named Michael, who's 21, and a daughter named Alyssa, who's 19. They have been a tremendous blessing and a tremendous challenge to be a parent on the spectrum, raising spectrum children. I'm also a nana to 2 granddaughters. One is suspected with Asperger's syndrome. Delaney is 6. She's the one that we suspect with Asperger's syndrome, and Kylie is 2. And that's turning a whole new realm, because I felt like my children in itself has forced me to be part of life, because I had to be their mom and I had to be their advocate. And I thought once they grew up that it would cause me to revert and go back to my introverted self and not want anything to do with society or world outside of my home. But then my grandchildren came and told me a whole nother stories about to take place. So I will have to continue to be part of the world because they love the zoo, they love things that I like to do, so it does encourage me that I still have connections to the world outside of me. And as I shared in a speak yesterday, we do have, my one granddaughter is neurotypical developing so far, and we're asking for help in the sense of humor of how to raise her, because we have no clue when you're a family of autistics, and you get one NT child, it's like a whole nother area. And I suppose when you have a family that's mostly neurotypical and raising an autistic child, you have the same kind of sense. What do we do about this child? Well, we're saying the same about little Kylie. And even though Kylie's not on the spectrum, she's a very defiant little 2-year-old, and she has a will of her own already. So that's really hard for this Nana to cope with. But on the side, I love doing photography. I'm not a professional at it, but I do love to do that because it hones into the art in the way that I really see the world, and I see things that people don't. It's like people go on a hike, but they just keep walking, and I want to stop because I take in everything that I see, and I can see the art in that. And I've also said that I'm an author and a poet, but I see the world through poetry. And it's not just seeing the world. My whole world realms around it and things like a fashion of poetry. I am a national speaker who speaks on a variety of topics on autism, so I do travel a lot and do a lot of speaking. I am the director of the Young Leaders Division for AGI, and I serve as an advisory council member for the OCALI, which stands for the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incident in the state of Ohio. And now we'll go on to our presentation. A lot of times people don't understand that stuck or being stuck can happen in many facets of our life. And so the first part we're going to talk about is when we can become socially and emotionally stuck. This happens because as we're developing, we begin to see our aged peers moving on in life processes, such as jobs, driving, and marrying, or even becoming parents. Aged peers or friendships moving forward, leaving us behind. And sometimes we might develop some friendships when we're younger, but as we start to get a little older, those peers take off with other friendships and kind of leave you behind. Then you end up with no friendships, and it kind of gives you that isolated feeling. Parents or caregivers comparing us to siblings or others. And I don't know how many times growing up or even now in my advocacy work, I hear them saying, why can't you act like your sister? Why can't you try to do something like your brother? Or Johnny next door is doing this, why aren't you doing this? And so those comparisons by well-meaning people can actually encourage and foster that getting stuck emotionally and socially. As we also start to develop from our middle school years and up, we have higher demands and expectations placed on us, setting us up for failure because sometimes those expectations don't match where our current development is or where we currently are within our autism. Navigating systems that slam doors shut in our face. Valerie talked a little bit about the self-advocacy, and it's a great thing if it's used effectively. But if we haven't been trained how to effectively use it, what happens is it becomes what I've been learned as a double-edged sword. And so instead of getting advocacy and getting supports that you need, it can actually close the doors, such as when I was trying to self-advocate for myself about the needs for services in my state from the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities. It was a difficult battle, and I couldn't seem to get the systems, but they kept saying, if you can say words like this, then you don't need to have our supports. And so instead of getting help, I was closing doors but I was trying to do what Ohio's push was for self-determination and self-advocacy, but the more I did it, the more the doors closed instead of opened. And so we have to be able to know how to effectively advocate. And the other things that help us get socially and emotionally stuck is no access to friendships or isolations. And sometimes I see our kids, and they only have involvements with their families, and they don't have a lot of supports even from the family to move on out to do other activities and things. And then even in my adult group, in my psychology department, there's 11 of us, and many of those still live with their moms and dads and still have no friends, and they only go out to a movie if their moms go out to a movie. They don't go out and do do anything with anybody. There's no activities, and they're 30, 40, 50 years old, and they still have no sense of being able to get unstuck and figure out how they can have some life for themselves. So I'll let Paul, and when we're going to do these slides, the way we'll do it is that we're each going to leave the slides up, and then Paul's going to pick 1 or 2 items off of each slide as well to talk about.
Okay. Sondra brought up some really good points on what she just shared on all these points on the slide, and all of these apply to me as well. One of the things that's really that comes to my mind is the higher demand and expectations placed on us, and that's true. As we get older, we have higher demands, but I think people that are challenged with different disabilities, it would be a higher demand than the average person because of the inherent disability, whatever that is. So just that in itself would be a higher demand. And then there's the protocol to have to catch up and to catch up with the quote normal peers, and that's a really higher demand. And I find, and from my experience, I found that being in school and different work environments and just different environments in general where there was a demand placed on me, it's like I had to run twice as hard, twice as fast to try to do the same thing that the average person would have done in completing that task a lot of times. And so one of the things that I've learned from that is that I have to redefine what is it I need to do. Maybe I need to redefine what it is I need to accomplish, whatever that task is. And like an example would be being able to aspire to getting a particular degree. And yes, I want to push as much as I can, but maybe I have to look at my own limitations too. I have to weigh that out and take that into account when I'm making plans for all these processes or all these goals and endeavors. So I have to weigh out all of that. And the other thing is navigating the system that slams the doors in my face. And again, like for me, would be school, work, access to social clubs, all kinds of different things. I can go down a whole list as to what all these things are, and because I was a little bit different, it's like, and it can be even on a subtle level, people would look at me like, gee, I'm not fitting in and to the protocol, and it's really, and I noticed that it's really evident it could be really evident in the workplace. And I think school, is somewhat evident, but then there's some accommodations with school. But I found that like in the work world, it was really evident where there's a lot of times that the employers could be very unforgiving, and being able to advocate for myself. And I think a lot of it is being able to find the right fit for all of these situations, whether it be school, work, or the social group that I want to hang out with, or a social group that fits for me. And I think one of the things that I'm realizing is finding that more than just trying to meet the standard, as the quote standard, is trying to find my niche and where I fit in. I think once I took that approach, then I found that to be really helpful and trumping these other obstacles.
Yes, and the same thing like with the aged peers moving on in life processes. One of my sons in personnel, he shared to me that he's really frustrated because he sees his friends having jobs and driving, and some of them are getting married and having children, and he's 21 years of age. But I had to show him, like even on this list, I said, even though you didn't learn to drive until you were 20, you're now driving. And I said, and you didn't think you could have a job, and you started out at Ruby Tuesdays washing dishes, and within a year's time you went to head chef at Ruby Tuesdays. And now you moved and quit Ruby Tuesdays and went to Bravo's, and you're working your way right up again. And so you're already doing two things that you're kind of redefining. Maybe it didn't happen when you were 16, and it's happening now at 20. So it doesn't mean that you'll never get there. You just have to redefine that there's going to be a different time space for you to achieve those things. And then I told him, even if you didn't learn how to drive, it's not the end of the world. You could figure out other ways for transportation, just so that he doesn't get stuck and feel as if he can't move forward.
One thing I'd just like to share on that is, Sondra, isn't it? It's like a different path to go to the same destination,
yes.
Isn't it?
Yes, and that's what is important to help our young people understand, that just because you can't do something now doesn't mean it's a lifetime forever. You're never going to drive. Even if you're not able to physically maneuver driving, you can figure out other ways for means of transportation that still get you from point A to point B, and still gives you that sense of individualism and stuff. And even Chloe, the young speaker that was in here earlier, and she shared the first time that she took up public transportation, got on a bus and went, I think, to the mall, she said, independently, and was able to come back home. She was so proud of herself. And then she said, I did it all by myself. And I said, I knew you could. And so that gave her a sense of freedom, knowing just because I'm visually impaired and that I'm not going to be able to drive, I know now that I can have means of transportation and still have a life and be able to get where I want to go. It goes around a different path. But not only do we get socially and emotionally stuck, but we can also become physically stuck due to constraints, such as lack of income to participate into recreational outlets or interest, lack of access to transportation, lack of social opportunities, or lack of invites or inclusions, lack of like peers or models, and creating a physically locked-in state. And lack of skills or supports to navigate through these barriers to gain access. And what all of this really means is that sometimes those constraints that we have on us are due to some of these physical constraints are due to the financial situation. Many of us aren't able to have gainful employment. Many of us end up on some kind of supplemental income, and that doesn't allow for us to have housing and everything else that we need, plus be able to afford or even figure out how to navigate a recreational activity if we chose to. So those are some of the things that can cause a physical stuck due to constraints, which is one of the good things about Facebook and some of the other social outlets. It at least gives some of those that are kind of shut in an outlet. But we got to figure out how to get unstuck even physically. And there are many things you can do if you have limited income, even if you have like a camera. You know, like I do, I walk around and I take walks and take lots of pictures of nature. And that's something that helps me from being physically constrained. And again, in my area, we don't have public transportation except for if you were to walk 1.5 miles to the nearest bus stop. And many of us don't have that ability to navigate the roadways. And so I am advocating my area to open up that because there's so many that are shut in because they don't have no means of transportation. And so we just have to learn how to navigate around some of those things, and then I'll let Paul share.
Okay. That's all of these points speak for me. And one of the things that I found with these issues that Sondra just shared and from my experience is a person can get very depressed. I went through a lot of depression when I was stuck in these different situations, and then I had to learn how to get myself unstuck and find unconventional ways to move on from it. And the lack of income, that's a huge one. With the struggle with jobs and career and being able to find that niche comes the lack of income. And that's where, for me, one of the ways I solved that was developing a handyman business, because then I could provide the income to be able to move on and do the things that I needed to do and think out of the box and solving some of these issues. And for me, that's where I came up with the idea of starting the handyman business, because I refused to be stuck in that in that situation, the lack of income. And so that's where I came up with, and I figured if there's a will, there's a way. I'm not going to stay stuck. And I knew that there was a purpose for my life, so thus I moved on. The lack of social opportunities and lack of invites, that's a big one too. And I think all of these points, a lot of them, they go hand in hand. And when I was out of the loop, then people don't know I exist. So, and then it's like I'm just alone and just isolated. And then it was so easy for me to get caught in my isolation that I'm sitting there by myself trying to figure out, gee, why am I isolated? And all the self-introspection, as good as it is, and it's helpful in some ways, couldn't fill that missing piece. And I did a lot of soul searching to try to solve that problem, but it's like I was doing it. It got to a point after a while where I was just doing it in a vacuum, and I needed, on that particular issue, I needed other people to help solve that issue of the isolation, and then also being able to put myself out there. And sometimes it would be uncomfortable to go into strange social situations and to explore what is going to work for me and what is not, and getting in touch with that. I think in a lot of ways that's like doing the meditation and where I'm in the spiritual practice, where I'm digging into myself to look at some of those difficult processes, that some of the stuff that I was sharing with in the trauma video earlier, and to be able to have that spirit of moving on and to look for that niche. And lack of peer models, that's a big one for me too, because as I mentioned before, I didn't have nobody even knew what ASD was. I mean, and I had it, and I didn't even know I had it. And there was no role models for me. I think a role model would have been very, very helpful for me to navigate the obstacles, the social obstacles in the world, as well as other obstacles. And I was able to develop that later in life, but in all those years, the 40 years before that, I didn't have it. And so that was a huge one for me.
Yes, I think that was a big one for me too, is the lack of peer model, not having anybody that was like me. And even Chloe, when we first met, she said that was the most important thing to her, is that she finally found somebody that was like her, that somebody was presenting autism pretty much like she presents it. And she's seen other individuals through her school have autism, but she said, my autism didn't match up to anything like theirs, and I couldn't connect to anybody. And then she met me, and we connected right away. And then I met Danny, and her and I connected right away. It was because we have very similar presentations. And so a lot of times I think, well, this person has autism, so we'll just put them in the room with this other person with autism, and just like magic, they'll become best friends. It doesn't work that way, just like typical kids. There's personalities behind our autism, and we need to have those kinds of peer models that are like us. All of us in this world need somebody that's like us. That's how we build our friendships, and there's through similar experiences. So I can relate to Paul on that. And the social opportunities, a lot of times we might get invited, but if you have limited income, you don't have the means to pay for some of these things. Like, and some people will want you to maybe join a bowling league. Well, what if you're on limited income and you can't afford to do bowling shoes and bowling ball in the leagues every single week? And that just causes you to have to say no, which causes you to lose social opportunity. So we'll go on to the next slide.
Sondra, I would just like to add that in addition to the limited income is being able to fit into that social constraint.
Yes.
And that is a huge issue as well, because you could have all the money in the world, and if you don't fit into that social constraint, they're still not going to accept you.
Exactly. And usually we try to connect to people that are like us, and it's kind of hard to have recreational outlets that have just people with autism or developmental disabilities that are within us, within our realms to build a friendship with. Not only can we get socially, emotionally stuck and physically stuck, but we can become spiritually stuck, such as lacking access to faith teachings due to physical constraints, meaning you can't even get to church. You know, even if you were brought up under some kind of a faith or belief, and now you're an adult and you want to continue that, you may not have transportation to get to the church. You might not have a means to drive or have gas monies to get to the church. So you have that physical constraint locking you out. And even sometimes if you do find a church, you may become feeling socially rejected or isolated within that same church as an individual. It may not be the same church you grew up in, but the same faith beliefs. And you start to attend there and you find out they're not so accepting of your differences. And so you can spiritually get locked out from some churches. Shouldn't happen, but it does more often than not. Lack of spiritual direction. Many times people don't help us guide that. You know, that's an important part of our own human existence. And we can choose which faith beliefs that we choose to direct our own selves into. And or even if we're in a faith belief that we have of our own, we don't have mentors to help build that strength in our faith. And so oftentimes we find out that we're giving up and self-rejecting of our own faith beliefs because well, that's a whole nother presentation. But there's times there that some churches will put their own views on you about what's happening in your life instead of understanding, and it begins to make you think that, like with my belief, I believe there is a God, okay? So I might say, well, God doesn't really love me, or he doesn't really care about me because of these things, and if he really did, then he wouldn't allow these things to happen. So you begin to have your own spiritual battles, which can cause you to become spiritually stuck. Spiritual explorations, defining our own faith ideas and beliefs that conflict with family views and our beliefs, creating family chaos and conflict. And sometimes you might grow up under one faith, but as you become an adult, you may want to explore a different faith. And then you think that faith matches more to your lifestyle and more to what you believe in. And your family comes down on you very hard and says, no, we were raised under this one belief. How can you believe that way? This is wrong. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. And that causes a conflict of your own individual choices as an adult. And you should be allowed to choose, but you're having that conflict. And or you're unable to interpret spiritual concepts at a higher level and criticized because of it. And people think you go to church, you should be able to interpret what's being said. And just to share that sometimes when I was at my own church, and one time the pastor said something like he was in a phone conversation with God all weekend. Well, I took that very literal, and I thought, how did he know the number to God? And then I was really stuck the rest of the time. But it's those kinds of concepts that if we don't get them, but people think because we're higher ended, that whatever that means, but typically people put us those categories, but they would assume that I should have understood that concept, and if I don't and walk away, that's what I learned, you know. And so then there's that spiritual stuck sensation or feeling. And then Paul, I'm going to let you share now.
Okay. And spiritually stuck would go hand in hand with the other issues in the other slides that we just shared. And if you're feeling stuck in the physical, the other practical ways like the financial and the social, spiritually stuck a lot of times goes hand in hand, will follow or be part of that. And one of the things that I believe is that there is a perfect God, but there's no perfect church. And so it's like I just accept that I mean, as well-meaning as a lot of religious organizations, churches are, we're all human, and there's no perfect organization. And one of the things that I found happening a lot of times is the lack of spiritual direction in my life. I think before I found that, it was like trying to, it was like I was just in a search mode. And I think I needed to find that in myself, and then branch out from there, to be able to find that spiritual direction for myself, and that connection to God or the higher power in directing my life, and then other things, everything else would follow from there. And I had a number of situations where I'd go to where I was at a church and just feel rejected, or it was not, even though like on the surface a lot of times they would be accepting, but sometimes in some situations, but under the surface it would not necessarily be that accepting. I think one of the experiences that I had was when I shared that when I was going through my employment struggles, and with when my Asperger's diagnosis came out, when I shared that with people there, it's like I got a lot of negative just comments, or just people just kind of looked at me like I was strange, and kind of like they didn't really want to deal with it. I mean, I did have some people that were supportive, but generally in some of those situations, I felt uncomfortable sharing the Asperger's diagnosis when it first came out, and so I just had to deal with that. And spiritual exploration, defining our own faith, ideas, beliefs, and conflicts, family views, and all of that, I had to do that for myself. I guess especially I became a Christian coming from a Jewish background, and it didn't really, my family was okay with it, but somehow it wasn't something that was really that somebody does. But it's like I was following my own spiritual calling, not from what everybody else was saying that I should do, but what was inside me. And also, one of the things that I realized is that I'm the one that has to deal with those issues, all those hard issues in life. Those other people aren't going to be dealing with it for me, even though they're well-meaning. They're still not going to be dealing with it, helping me for it. And then I just have to look at the dysfunction in my own family and see, okay, what is their spiritual life like? And there's issues there. And so I think for me, finding that spiritual bedrock, and then having that for the bedrock, and then going out from there has been really, really helpful.
Okay. We'll go into the next slide.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
This one's good because this one will be really for you.
Okay.
Okay. Employment. Redefining how our employment might look like, self-employment instead of traditional work as an option, using already set skills that we have. And sometimes people try to force us into a mold of employment that doesn't match our skill set, and then they're wondering why it's not successful. Like many of the jobs that vocational trainings wants to do is send us to hotels to fold towels, when many of us have higher ability that could do something that's more meaningful for our lives. Just like many of you choose jobs that are meaningful to you. Well, autistics want something that's meaningful to them as well. Advocate for the type of work that you want to achieve and strive for. Do not settle for mundane jobs that have no real benefit to you, as it will have little to no benefit for you or your employer either. Find ways to put into place your own means of self-rewards at the end of the day. And people laugh at me, but I do speak nationally all over, and I put into my contract not only my needs for the physical ability to present, but I also put in my needs, my behavioral modification thing is a Diet Coke. And then I know Diet Coke is bad and poison, but it's my transitional tool, it's my regulator, and so they always laugh when they see that part on the contract. Must have a fresh Diet Coke from McDonald's sitting on the podium. And so they always say, do you care if it's from Burger King? I said, no, as long as it's not from KFC or some other place. And they say, why? I said, because their ice tastes nasty and it changes the whole taste of the soda. And it has to be Diet Coke from Burger King or McDonald's, but it has to be on the podium when I'm ready to speak. And that way, if I get overwhelmed and overloaded, sensory-wise, at least I have one tool very close to me that will help me regulate. So we do need to put those things in. And one of the things my doctor's been teaching me is that with each of my paychecks that I get, to buy myself something small. And because I never used to think that I could do that. I always thought I had to pay everything to everything and never spend any money on myself, which was causing me to get frustrated with the job because I wasn't seeing the rewards of it. It was like money that was just handed to me but handed right back out and nothing at the end of it. So now I learned to, I'm very big on half-price bookstore, and so I spend $20 a month at half-price book and come home with 20 new things, 20 new books from the store. But we need to do that. Each and every one of you do that. You might buy yourself a Starbucks coffee or something on the way home from payday work week or whatever. But we're not trained to do that, and we need to learn how to do that because it's an important factor. We also need to explore and discover what tools we will need, what will be needed to help you to cope the transitions out of the home and to work, which I said is my Diet Coke, and that will be beneficial to you during the day and throughout the workday. A lot of people laugh at me because they say I drink too much Diet Coke, and I tell them, well, that's the only transitional tool that I have found that is effective and works. If I know I need to leave the house to go somewhere, my anxiety is so high, I'm overwhelmed, I don't want to go, I'm trying to avoid going, but if I know I'm going to go get a Diet Coke and then transition, I can cope that transition a little bit better. And so we all need to figure out what those sensory tools are that helps us moving from being stuck to moving forward. And then he's going to talk from a whole different perspective about employment. Just my last final thought is I really haven't been able to maintain or obtain true, genuine employment for myself that was not meaningful or long-lasting until I began to look at my skill sets and began to market my own skill set as speaking and presenting and using those tools, and now I'm able to make my own income through that means. And I feel successful because I can set my own schedule, I can work it around my sensory needs, and all of those things are taken into place, and now I feel like I have a sense of success through employment.
Okay, thank you, Sondra. Okay, employment, that's a huge one. That was a huge one for me, and I know it is for a lot of people on the spectrum. And redefining how our employment might look like self-employed, like being self-employed instead of traditional work as an option, using the skill sets that I had already. And that's what I did when I started my handyman business, because it's like I looked down in myself, and it's like, okay, what do I have to start the business? And just pieced things together and just came up with the idea of starting it, and then just marketing, and went step by step to set it up, and was able to do it methodically, set and do it. And one of the things that's been difficult for me was trying to fit into the conventional employment niche, and I've never really been able to do that. I mean, over a long course. Well, one of the things that I'll say that I did was I did a term in the military, which was successful, even though that had its issues too. But trying to fit into the conventional company and the conventional line and the conventional social structure of the company, somehow I've never been able to really do that. And then getting past those interviews and trying to dress myself a certain way. I mean, and what I mean by that is trying to put on that social veneer, that social, there's a word I'm looking for, I can't quite describe it, but that social facade to try to fit into that niche in a particular company, and that's always been difficult for me. Even though I would have the skill set to do that particular job, I would not be able to get into that. An example would be when I had just finished my military stint. I worked as an engineering technician for 3 years doing doing construction, working on construction plans, surveying and drafting of construction plans, and I could not get into working with a surveying or a drafting company. I couldn't find a job working for a surveying drafting company, and somehow I'd always be screened out at the interviews, and so that never worked out. So I had to move on, and career-wise, that would be an example. And I think some of the things that Sondra pointed out, the advocating for myself is, and the conditions. Sometimes we have to make concessions because there are situations where we have to do things that we don't want to do, and tolerate certain things because we have to make the income sometimes. But then there's a point where we have to draw the line as to how far will I go on that, and when enough is enough in a particular situation. And I think what Sondra made a good point is being able to advocate myself in a job situation and ask for what's reasonable. And I think that's what I've found to be helpful. And I do that in setting up different contracts, because I've done quite a number of speaking and speaking engagements and different handyman jobs, and I learned that I need to set up for what's reasonable, because the other person, they're not going to be looking out for my needs in that most of the time. Sometimes they do, but not always. And so I could go on with this topic, but because of the interest of time, we'll have to move on.
And the next topic area is relationships, and we can also get stuck there. Just because our aged peers are having girlfriends or boyfriends and marrying or becoming parents does not mean that all people that age have to do these things to feel successful. And so sometimes we have to let our kiddos know that if they choose to want to be a single life, that's fine. If they're choosing to find a relationship, then they can just continue to be working towards those goals.
I used to try to I went for a long period of time thinking, oh gee, all my friends are having relationships and dating and getting married and all that, and then what's happened to me? And then somehow I'm stuck. And this was about 20 years ago. I was going through this when I was in my 30s, and I was wondering, gee, feeling like very defective. And one of the things that I realized, that I remember from that time, was it's like I had a lot of things on my plate that I had to work through before I could really start developing relationships. And if I didn't do that, then it was just going to make the relationships would just end in disaster. And so I had to be very practical about it, and that's one of the things that helped me there. And then I think one of the other things that helped me was being comfortable with myself. What is my life path, and the path that's laid out for me, and not necessarily by what society thinks or the society norms, but what is my life path. And maybe it is to have a relationship, but maybe that's not the primary focus. And I think now, I've had a number of relationships, and I haven't been married, and eventually it just wasn't right. Those relationships, over time, I'm dating somebody now, which actually is working out pretty well, but it's really hard to wait on the right timing and then to know that. But then I think that's instinctively I had to do that, because otherwise, if I'm just trying to fit into society's norms, then I can just cause myself a lot of problems, and society isn't going to bail me out.
I like that you're dating now. I didn't know that. We're friends. You didn't share.
So a lot more that I can share on this topic, but unfortunately for the interest of time, we're going to have to move on.
Okay, now I'm going to kind of rush through a few slides and then stop again when I know there's an area where Paul needs to really express me because he's got good insight. But when faulty expectations collide with our ability level, can also cause us to get stuck. It causes an internal emotional crash because we have that social, emotional, developmental age, and then we have our chronological age, and then we have our intellectual age all within the same being. And sometimes those things collide and crash, and it causes us to go into chaos and crisis. It causes profound sense of failure. And it's a metaphor, but it causes sinkholes of depression, isolation, self-medication, and suicidal ideation. It shuts down our motivations to try and or to move forward, and causes self-rage or external rages towards others. We don't have the time to go through it, but I will just briefly share that one of my own sons right now is currently, he's high-functioning Asperger's syndrome, has a job, but he doesn't have any friends. He's not moving forward socially. He's actually in the midst of this stuck stage that we see many of our older teens, young adults get stuck in these stages. And he's right now exploring with the self-medication of alcohol, which is a very dangerous combination when we don't know how to regulate and know when to stop and how much is enough and how much is not enough. And so we're really dealing with some battles at home with that because everything is a faulty expectations for him. And when being stuck causes indulgence of risky behavior, we realize that with autism we might struggle with regulation. That means that we explore risky behavior that might lead to addictions or unhealthy outlets, as I shared about my son. And realize that these addictions do not have to be part of our life process and do not define us, but sometimes for a short period, some of our older teens and young adults do get stuck in this realm. Drugs and alcohol are often temporary social, emotional, self-medicating, faulty expectations that can lead to an intensified faulty sense of self, which means intensifying the stuck. And so you have an individual who's already socially, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, and all those other realms stuck, and then they think with the self-medication that it's going to make their life better. They're just intensifying and prolonging the stuck. Faulty rationalizing of these choices can actually bind you to them and bring your life process to your life process as added challenges of defeat through the addiction. So now not only are you dealing with all those other things, you're now dealing with autism and addiction. I personally haven't dealt with those things. I'm seeing those through some of my sons. And Paul, did you want to share anything about those two slides? Okay.
Yes, Sondra spoke very well on those points from those two slides and all the points on those slides, and I went through very similar experiences that Sondra's sons were going through when I was in my 20s, and I had to find ways to move out of that because I knew that if I didn't, that my life was going to be over. I mean, namely in the alcohol and different ways of coping with those environments. And I realized that a lot of that came from being stuck. I mean, the social isolation was at the root of a lot of that, and at the root of that, then some of the spiritual issues too. But the big thing for me was the social isolation and the faulty and the expectations trying to fit into society's norms of, oh gee, I have to catch up, I have to achieve these goals. Everybody else is doing it, why can't I? What's wrong with me? And being stuck in those broken record thoughts is what I found myself to get stuck in those negative behaviors and those negative situations. And the way I got out of that was to redefine my life and what my real purposes were. And I had a sense when I was stuck in that and I was following that path, the bad path, that it's like I could almost feel death inside myself, like this is a waste. I'm just going to throw my life away. And I wasn't here to throw my life away. And from there, then I was able to start turning things around. And I was 29 or 30 when that happened, and then I was able to start moving on a more positive path and getting the proper supports to address all those issues. And I could do a whole presentation just on this topic alone. Unfortunately, time won't allow. So I will have to leave it here. That particular topic.
One of these days, I wish we'd have 2 hours and talk about that. But just reading, I'm going to read through the last slides and then we'll be done. Redefining our normal is important for us because people throughout our life have determined what our normal should look like instead of asking us what our normal should look like. So discover within ourselves what is normal for us. How do we make this normal fit into society and yet meet our own internal needs? Learning the vocabulary to self-advocate and speak out, meaning using our own voice instead of everybody else's. Learning how to use our voice for our benefit, and sifting out what other expectations are towards us and redefining that. And learning to let go of some faulty expectations that others have set or that we have set for ourselves that are not realistic at the time in our lives. Finding new ways to navigate our community, gaining access, finding outlets that do meet or are within our realms of financial budget, discover if it meets a need to access and will have mutual benefit, connecting to like peers for peer modeling and supports as well as balancing out the friendships, and focus on positive outlets that encourage and support instead of degrade and tear down. The first step to move forward is to take that first step, putting realistic goals for self. Do not place too much expectations in front of us due to setting us up for failure. Too many times people want us to work on too many things too fast, and then it just causes that emotional crash. Achieve one goal at a time until you master it, knowing that with mastery, we must allow ourselves room for setbacks, mistakes, and other things. And that these things do not mean failure, it means process. Because for anybody to move forward, it's a process. Building off of learned success will lead to taking 2 steps forward. One is always becoming and has never become. In life, all humans, regardless of autism, are evolving, learning, becoming. None of us have ever reached that final state of becoming. I'm not reading well without my glasses. Once I gave birth, some will say I have become a mother. But in reality, a mother is not an instant place of being due to childbirth, but is a process. So even though my children are all young adults in life, I still am becoming their mother, evolving, learning, and becoming. And that's the end of our presentation.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
I think we did good on time. We just had to wrap.
The Autism Research Institute relies on the generosity of donors like you to make this webcast possible. If you enjoy this presentation, please consider making a donation. Thank you.